In the popular imagination, the British Empire is won in great set-piece battles, infantry lines at Minden, the Heights of Abraham above Quebec, or the windswept decks at Trafalgar. Yet if we follow the money, rather than the monuments, a very different map of imperial importance appears. On this map, some of the most valuable real estate in the 18th century world is not sprawling continents, but tiny, volcanic specks in the Caribbean Sea. Guadeloupe, Martinique, Saint Lucia, Jamaica, Barbados and their neighbours formed what one historian has called the Golden Archipelago of Britain's Atlantic economy. They were islands soaked in sugar, rum, and blood. To understand why redcoats were shipped across the Atlantic to die in frightening numbers under the tropical sun, we must begin with a brutally simple fact. Sugar was money. In an age before industrial mass production, before fossil fuels and modern finance, the cane fields of the Caribbean were engines of wealth that punched far above their geographic weight, cultivated and harvested by enslaved Africans, processed in mills that ran day and night. Sugar and its byproducts fed European demand for sweetened tea, cakes, chocolate, and spirits. In Britain alone, the sugar industry accounted for a measurable slice of national income and fueled a transatlantic complex of merchants, insurers, shipbuilders, and refiners. From London's perspective, therefore, these islands were not remote garden spots, but critical assets. Every sack of French or Spanish sugar that reached European markets was a blow to British merchants. Every British conquest of a sugar island was a lever at the peace table. This helps to explain one of the most striking and seemingly irrational debates of the 7 Years' War. Should Britain keep Canada or Guadeloupe? Some politicians argued that the fertile, slave-based monoculture of a Caribbean island was more valuable than the entire expanse of French Canada. Others saw in continental conquests the seedbed of future population and trade. The debate itself reveals just how central the Caribbean had become in strategic thinking. Yet the Caribbean sugar wars were not simply about profit. They were also about denying rivals the means to challenge Britain's broader maritime and imperial position. French and Spanish colonies in the region served as naval stations, privateer bases, and hinge points of transatlantic shipping. Ports such as Martinique's Fort Royal, Guadeloupe's Basse-Terre, Cartagena de Indias on the mainland, and Havana in Cuba were fortified harbours where enemy fleets could refit, assemble convoys, and menace British trade routes. To allow those bases to prosper was to accept that French and Spanish power would remain a constant threat in the Atlantic. The logic, then, was double-edged. Capturing sugar islands promised immediate economic gain and long-term weakening of rivals. Failing to do so meant accepting not only lost profits, but ongoing strategic vulnerability. In this calculation, the human cost was weighed in relatively cold terms. Britain could, in theory, raise more regiments. Ships could carry more soldiers. The opportunity to deprive France or Spain of a major sugar colony or a naval stronghold seemed, on paper, to justify the risk. The reality on the ground, or more precisely in the mangroves, cane fields, and harbour approaches, was far harsher than any neat Whitehall memorandum suggested. Caribbean campaigns pitted redcoats not only against enemy garrisons and militia, but against an environment that seemed actively hostile to European bodies and European methods of war. Tropical heat, sudden storms, and especially disease killed far more men than musketry or cannon fire. On some expeditions, fever swept through whole brigades before they even reached the siege lines. The statistics from Cartagena and Havana read less like military returns and more like the ledger of a plague. This is one of the central arguments of our story. The Caribbean Sugar Wars were not simply another chapter in the familiar saga of British-French-Spanish rivalry. They were a distinctive kind of conflict in which climate, ecology, and disease acted as a third power, one that could overturn strategic plans and render numerical advantages meaningless. The redcoat in the tropics was as likely to be felled by a mosquito as by a musket ball. That fact shaped tactics, timelines, and outcomes in ways that traditional battlefield narratives tend to underplay. Another key argument is that these wars, despite their scale and consequences, have slipped into relative obscurity. They are overshadowed by better-known campaigns in North America and Europe, by the later drama of abolition, and by the discomfort of acknowledging that Imperial Britain expended tens of thousands of lives to defend and expand a slave-based economic system. If we wish to understand the true engines of the 18th century British Empire, however, we cannot avert our gaze. The Caribbean Sugar Wars were where imperial ideals collided most starkly with economic reality. Notions of liberty and civilization on the one hand, and on the other, a willingness to trade human suffering for national wealth. In the sections that follow, we will trace how this logic drove Britain into the Caribbean, how redcoats and sailors confronted French and Spanish strongholds amid fever-ridden harbours, and how success and failure in these campaigns reshaped the wider imperial balance. We will see a pattern: early overconfidence and catastrophe at Cartagena, hard lessons learned in blood, and then a more ruthless, methodical assault on Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Havana. Above all, we will argue that the British rise to global supremacy cannot be understood without this forgotten theatre where disease, sugar, and sea power combine to forge and nearly break the Redcoat Empire in the tropics. To grasp the full significance of Britain's Caribbean campaigns, we must reconstruct the world that awaited the Redcoat the moment he stepped onto a tropical shore. This was not an empty battleground. It was a complex social and military ecosystem dominated by entrenched European rivals, powerful mixed-race militias, vast enslaved populations, and fortresses carved into the very geography of island and coast. The Caribbean was, in effect, a mosaic of competing societies layered atop the violent economic foundation of plantation agriculture. Each island was its own microstate, ruled by unique combinations of colonial administrators, merchant elites, plantation oligarchs, and, in practice, the enslaved labour that kept the entire structure functioning. Spain's Caribbean sphere, stretching from Cuba and Puerto Rico to the fortress city of Cartagena de Indias on the mainland, was defined by long-standing military institutions. The Spanish Empire had been entrenched in these waters for centuries, and its defensive system reflected deep experience with maritime threats. In Cartagena, Havana, and San Juan, the Spanish constructed fortifications that were among the most formidable in the Americas. Morro Castle guarding Havana, and the concentric defences of Cartagena, designed by engineers who blended Italian and Iberian principles, represented an architecture of resistance that required not just courage, but engineering mastery to overcome. These ports served as hubs for treasure fleets crossing the Atlantic, and as bastions that symbolised Spain's determination to maintain relevance in an era of rising British naval power. Spanish armies in the Caribbean were typically a blend of European-born regulars, local Creole soldiers, and militias composed of free people of colour. Contrary to later European assumptions, these latter groups were often disciplined, well-organised, and partially acclimatised to the tropical climate. They represented a tactical advantage that British forces, arriving from cooler climates and lacking immunity to local diseases, could not easily match. Spanish command structures also utilised indigenous guides and black auxiliaries whose knowledge of terrain and climate shaped defensive strategies. The Spanish approach in the Caribbean thus capitalised on local ecological understanding as much as on traditional fortification. The French Caribbean, by contrast, was driven by the economic dynamism of its plantations. French islands such as Martinique and Guadeloupe were not merely profitable, they were vital centres of the French imperial economy. Their sugar outputs enriched Bordeaux merchants, supported French naval expenditures, and helped finance the broader colonial system. This wealth funded robust militia networks and defensive systems. While not always as formidable as the grand Spanish citadels, French coastal forts and interior redoubts were designed to delay invaders long enough for relief fleets to arrive from Europe or other colonies. Moreover, French colonial society relied heavily on free people of colour, who often served with distinction in localized defense, adding a social depth to the French war effort that British observers frequently underestimated. The enslaved populations on these islands, by far the majority of inhabitants, formed a silent but essential dimension of military life. Though not typically organized as formal fighting units, enslaved workers built and maintained fortifications, supplied armies, transported goods across rugged landscapes, and sometimes served as guides or informants. At moments of invasion, their actions could subtly shape the course of operations. Labor slowdowns, desertions into forests, or quiet assistance to British forces could weaken a colony's ability to resist. At the same time, many enslaved people feared that British occupation would simply replace one oppressive system with another. A realistic fear, as Britain itself relied on slavery throughout the 18th century. Their agency, often exercised in small acts rather than open revolt, remains an under-examined factor in the outcomes of several campaigns. When British forces launched their assaults in the Caribbean then, they faced more than enemy muskets. They confronted societies that had adapted to the rhythms and dangers of the tropics. The local French and Spanish defenders possessed not only tactical advantages, but biological ones: partial immunity to the region's endemic diseases. Yellow fever and malaria ravaged British troops with horrifying efficiency, frequently killing more soldiers than all enemy action combined. For defenders, this meant time itself was a weapon. If they could delay British siege operations long enough, disease would thin British ranks far more effectively than musketry from the parapets. In addition, the geography of these islands played directly into defensive hands. The mountainous interiors of Guadeloupe and Martinique allowed French defenders to retreat from the coasts and regroup in terrain where European-style battlefield maneuvers were nearly impossible. Thick vegetation concealed ambushes. Ravines and ridges slowed the movement of British artillery. Swamps, mangroves and cane fields forced the Redcoats into narrow, predictable avenues of approach, where small units of defenders could inflict disproportionate casualties. All of this meant that British commanders entering the Caribbean faced a complex strategic puzzle. They could not rely on the familiar formulas of European siegecraft alone. They needed naval superiority, rapid strikes to prevent disease from decimating their ranks, and an understanding of local social dynamics that was often lacking. Failures such as the Cartagena disaster emerged from this disconnect. A belief in the inherent superiority of British arms combined with a profound underestimation of the tropics' lethal realities. Yet it is precisely this interplay between European rivalries, Caribbean societies, and environmental forces that made the sugar wars so pivotal. They exposed the limitations of traditional imperial warfare and forced Britain to rethink how global campaigns should be conducted. This was not merely another theatre of the 7 Years' War. It was a proving ground for concepts of joint naval land operations, tropical logistics, and the harsh arithmetic of disease-driven attrition. As we move into the British experience itself, we will see how these underestimated foes and neglected spaces shape not only individual campaigns, but the wider balance of empire. The Sugar Islands became both a prize and a crucible, testing Britain's capacity to project power into environments utterly different from the European heartland. Understanding the adversaries and the world they inhabited is essential to making sense of the triumphs and tragedies that followed. When British soldiers arrived in the Caribbean, they carried with them the expectations of European warfare. Crisp drill, ordered battle lines, formal sieges, and the assumption that superior discipline would compensate for any local disadvantage. But almost immediately, the tropics revealed themselves as a different kind of battlefield, one where environment and ecology often proved more decisive than any general's plan. In this region, disease, heat, insects, rain, soil, and water all shaped the course of campaigns with a ruthless indifference to British strategy or courage. The Redcoats' traditional enemies, French musketeers or Spanish artillery, were only a fraction of the dangers he faced. The most lethal opponent was disease. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, and a host of lesser-known ailments ravaged European soldiers with astonishing speed. On the disastrous Cartagena expedition of 1741, for example, the majority of deaths occurred before the main assault began. Regiments that arrived with full strength were reduced to skeletal remnants within weeks. Officers who had trained their men for battlefield cohesion found themselves commanding companies weakened not by enemy volleys, but by fevers that swept through tents and trenches overnight. The arithmetic of Caribbean warfare was grim. For every soldier killed in combat, several more died from sickness. No amount of discipline or bravery could compensate for the biological vulnerability that accompanied European bodies into tropical climates. Part of the problem was ignorance. British medical theory in the mid-18th century could not explain the true causes of tropical diseases. Doctors blamed rotting vegetation, stagnant air, poor diet, or moral failings. Mosquitoes, the real vectors of yellow fever and malaria, were rarely considered even nuisances, let alone agents of mass mortality. As a result, British camps were often built on low ground near freshwater sources, precisely the breeding sites that ensured an explosion of disease. Latrines, food waste, and water storage practices only worsened conditions. Troops drank from contaminated streams, ate spoiled rations, and struggled to maintain even basic sanitation in the humid, insect-filled environments around their encampments. That the Redcoats died in such numbers was not only a function of climate, but of systematic misunderstanding. Heat was nearly as dangerous. Wool uniforms designed for the temperate climates of Europe became suffocating burdens under the sun. Soldiers marching uphill with packs, muskets, and ammunition boxes quickly collapsed from heat exhaustion. Officers too struggled. Heavy coats, cocked hats, and leather accoutrements turned even simple movement into a hazard. Campaigns often stalled not due to enemy action, but because half the army lay incapacitated by dehydration or heat stroke. British commanders learned slowly that the pace of war in the Caribbean could not match that of Europe. Rapid marches were suicidal, long sieges a gamble. Every day spent in exposed camps risked a surge in mortality that no reinforcements could easily replace. The terrain compounded these biological and climatic pressures. The Sugar Islands were shaped by volcanic forces and dense tropical growth. Inland routes were choked by forests, ravines, steep slopes, and tangled vines. Artillery trains struggled to move guns even short distances. Horses died in alarming numbers. What European generals might conceive as a simple flanking movement could, in reality, require cutting through trackless jungle while carrying supplies in oppressive heat. When the British attempted to penetrate the interior of Guadeloupe, they found themselves fighting not only French skirmishers, but an environment that resisted every step. Cannon had to be dragged up jagged inclines by exhausted soldiers who, even if unscathed by enemy fire, risked being bitten by insects carrying lethal fevers. Even the coastal approaches were treacherous. Amphibious landings, central to nearly every British plan, were complicated by reefs, surf, and unpredictable winds. Storms could scatter fleets or wreck supply ships before troops reached shore. The rainy season transformed the ground into mud that swallowed wheels and boots alike. Water supplies, often taken from local wells or rivers, might run dry or be cut off by defenders. In Havana, in 1762, one of the biggest crises during the siege was the capture and diversion of fresh water sources, contributing directly to thousands of British deaths from thirst and infection. The Caribbean, in short, provided the worst possible conditions for European-style siegecraft and logistics. These environmental challenges were not merely background difficulties. They shaped the strategic tempo of the war. French and Spanish commanders understood that delaying actions, withdrawals to interior strongholds, or simply holding out behind fortifications could allow disease and climate to do their work. A garrison that might be too small to repel a direct assault could remain confident that British forces, deprived of quick victory, would weaken rapidly. The defenders did not need to match British firepower. They needed only to survive and exploit the inevitable attrition. British persistence, however, was not limitless. Political pressure in London demanded results. Reinforcement convoys could take months to arrive. The longer a campaign dragged on, the more its costs escalated, not only in lives but in financial outlays for pay, supply, and naval upkeep. Commanders faced a strategic dilemma: move too quickly and risk catastrophic casualties from tropical conditions. Move too slowly and allow defenders to regain strength or disease to decimate the force. This tension defined the Caribbean sugar wars more than any battlefield maneuver. The environment also reshaped the composition of British forces. Local guides, sailors, and occasionally free people of colour from captured territories were essential for navigation and labour. Without these intermediaries, British troops could scarcely move through the interior terrain. The Redcoat became, in effect, dependent on local knowledge in ways that contradicted the imperial rhetoric of self-sufficient superiority. Yet even with such assistance, the British were never fully able to overcome the ecological realities of the region. In analysing the Caribbean sugar wars, then, it becomes clear that Britain was not merely confronting France and Spain. It was battling a set of environmental conditions uniquely hostile to European warfare. Victory required not only brute force, but an ability to adapt tactics, logistics, and expectations. It demanded a recognition that the tropics themselves were a strategic actor, one whose influence could nullify even the grandest imperial ambitions. Understanding this environmental dimension is essential to making sense of the disasters and triumphs that followed, and to appreciating the true cost of Britain's Caribbean empire. If the Caribbean was an ecological crucible, then the British assault on Cartagena de Indias in 1741 was the moment when imperial optimism shattered against the full force of tropical reality. No single campaign illustrates the contradictions, ambitions, and blind spots of Britain's Caribbean strategy more clearly than this catastrophic expedition. Conceived as a demonstration of overwhelming naval might, the operation instead became a symbol of hubris, an attempt to impose European assumptions on terrain and conditions that rendered them worthless. Cartagena was not simply a failed siege, it was a decisive lesson in what the Caribbean truly was: a battlefield where disease, climate, and fortification combined to neutralize even the strongest fleet Britain could send. The campaign began with breathtaking confidence. Admiral Edward Vernon had already enjoyed a limited success in capturing Portobello in 1739, a small victory that convinced both the public and Parliament that Spain's colonial defences were brittle. Buoyed by political enthusiasm and by growing tension with Spain over maritime rights, Britain assembled one of the largest expeditionary forces it had ever sent across the Atlantic. Ships crowded with soldiers, sailors, artillery, and supplies converged in the Caribbean, forming a fleet that dazzled contemporaries with its size. The expectation was simple: Cartagena would fall quickly, and its capture would open the door to further conquests, perhaps even Havana itself. Yet the assumptions embedded in this optimism were flawed at every level. Cartagena was no minor port. It was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Americas. Designed by master engineers, its defense consisted of layered fortifications, interconnected bastions, and expertly sited batteries guarding every approach. The harbour was protected by narrow channels that forced attackers into predictable, easily targeted routes. The defenders, Spanish regulars, local militia, and free people of colour, were familiar with the climate, committed to their city, and led by officers who understood that delay alone could be a winning strategy. When the British arrived, their numerical superiority and naval dominance were indeed intimidating. They succeeded in forcing some initial positions, capturing outlying forts at Boca Chica through grinding assaults supported by naval bombardment. But even these early triumphs masked deeper issues. The very act of landing thousands of soldiers began to expose them to the deadly ecology of the region. Tropical heat hammered men unused to such conditions. Mosquitoes bred in marshy landing zones. Water sources were limited, and sanitation broke down almost immediately under the stress of so many bodies packed into makeshift camps. The British commanders, however, still operated under European frameworks. They expected sieges to progress in orderly stages, with trenches dug, batteries emplaced, and breaches created through engineering. What they encountered instead was the slow collapse of their own strength as fevers swept through the camps. Lines of men who had shown discipline in battle now collapsed en masse as disease began to consume the expedition. Officers and privates alike succumbed. Leadership faltered not through cowardice, but through attrition. The logistical strain of caring for the sick further strained the already limited supply system. By the time the British turned toward the decisive assault on Fort San Lazaro, the key to taking Cartagena's inner defences, their army was already dangerously weakened. The attack itself was a model of planning on paper, but utterly disconnected from the realities on the ground. Scaling ladders were made too short. Coordination between land forces and naval support broke down. Troops attempting to climb steep, exposed slopes under darkness faced accurate Spanish fire from well-prepared positions. The assault failed catastrophically, and casualties were heavy. But even these losses paled in comparison to what disease would continue to inflict. In the days following the failed assault, yellow fever and malaria tore through the British ranks with terrifying speed. Units were reduced to fragments as soldiers died in their tents or were evacuated to ships already overflowing with sick men. The Navy, though less exposed on land, suffered its own wave of illness as cramped quarters and tainted water spread fevers rapidly. The combined Army-Navy force disintegrated not through enemy action, but through the very environment they had attempted to conquer. By late April, it was clear the expedition had failed. The British withdrew, abandoning thousands of dead and dying behind them. The campaign had cost Britain more lives than many major European battles of the century. Cartagena remained firmly in Spanish hands, its defenders vindicated, its fortifications intact. The lesson for Britain was brutal. Numerical superiority, naval dominance, and even initial successes could not overcome the compounded forces of disease, climate, and resilient fortification. Cartagena became a watershed in British imperial thinking, though its lessons would take years to be properly absorbed. It demonstrated that Caribbean campaigns required more than bravery and firepower. They demanded adaptation, an understanding of logistics in tropical climates, a respect for disease as a strategic factor, and the avoidance of prolonged operations that gave the environment time to inflict its deadly attrition. Above all, the disaster underscored that the Caribbean could not be treated as an extension of European theatres. It was a distinct world with distinct rules. Yet even with this stark warning, Britain did not abandon its ambitions in the tropics. The lure of sugar wealth and the strategic importance of disrupting French and Spanish power remained irresistible. The next great test, emerging in the 7 Years' War, would reveal whether Britain had absorbed Cartagena's lessons, or whether new disasters would repeat old patterns. As the empire prepared for renewed conflict, the ghosts of Cartagena cast a long shadow over every subsequent decision. In the aftermath of Cartagena, Britain stood at a crossroads. The empire had suffered one of the most shocking failures in its imperial history. An expedition that had sailed with unprecedented confidence returned home shattered, with thousands dead, officers disgraced, and public enthusiasm for easier victories suddenly sobered. Yet despite the scale of the disaster, British ambitions in the Caribbean did not diminish. If anything, the strategic value of the Sugar Islands grew even clearer. What changed dramatically was the way Britain approached warfare in the tropics. The years between Cartagena and the 7 Years' War saw a quiet but fundamental transformation in how the empire conceived, planned, and executed operations in the Caribbean. This transformation, more than any single battle, made Britain's later successes possible. The first insight that emerged was brutally simple. Prolonged campaigns were suicidal. At Cartagena, time had been the enemy's greatest ally. Every day spent digging trenches and waiting for siege artillery allowed yellow fever and malaria to thin British ranks. The British began to understand that the pace of Caribbean warfare must be accelerated. Quick, decisive assaults supported by naval supremacy would have to replace the protracted European-style sieges that had proved so deadly. If an island could not be taken in weeks rather than months, the campaign's logic collapsed under the weight of inevitable disease. This insight dovetailed with another hard-won lesson: the centrality of naval-land coordination. Cartagena had exposed failures in communication between army and navy. Assaults launched without proper naval bombardment, hesitation in exploiting breakthroughs, and disagreements between commanders all contributed to the disaster. By the 7 Years' War, Britain had resolved to treat amphibious operations as a single, integrated system. Fleets would carry not only soldiers, but artillery, supplies, medical staff, and fresh water. Ships would stand ready to support landings, reduce coastal fortifications, and shuttle troops rapidly from one island to another. This joint approach created a flexibility that was almost impossible for French or Spanish colonial defenders to match. Third, British commanders began to recognize that European tactics were ill-suited to the Caribbean interior. At Cartagena, the Redcoats had struggled against defensive positions built into hills and ridges, as well as against a climate that drained their strength before they even reached the enemy. In the interwar years, British officers serving elsewhere in the empire, particularly in India, experimented with more mobile, irregular tactics, using lighter equipment and adapting movements to local geography. Although the Caribbean remained a lower priority for doctrinal reform compared to India or North America, the Army's growing awareness of environmental constraints began to influence planning. When operations resumed in the Caribbean, commanders were more cautious about attempting inland advances without proper reconnaissance or overwhelming support. Another critical adaptation involved logistics and health. While 18th century medical science remained deeply flawed, British officials could no longer ignore the connection between poor sanitation, tropical climates, and catastrophic mortality. Ships and camps were reorganized to improve ventilation and cleanliness where possible. Greater care was taken in selecting landing sites and campgrounds, prioritizing high ground and better drainage. Although these measures did not eliminate disease, they slowed its spread. Moreover, the ability to withdraw the sick quickly to naval vessels, effectively floating hospitals, helped preserve fighting strength. Compared to the conditions at Cartagena, these improvements represented a significant shift toward pragmatic health management. Yet perhaps the most important change was psychological. Cartagena had stripped away any illusions that the capture of a major Caribbean stronghold would be easy. When planning resumed for operations in the 7 Years' War, British leaders adopted a far more sober, calculated tone. Ambitions remained large, but they were grounded in detailed intelligence, realistic assessments, and the understanding that certain islands were more vulnerable than others. Martinique, with its fortress at Fort Royal and rugged interior, was recognized as a far more difficult target than Guadeloupe. Havana, though immensely valuable, was known to require overwhelming force and meticulous planning. This new realism did not diminish Britain's aims. It refined them. The shift also extended to political strategy. The Sugar Islands were now understood not merely as military prizes, but as bargaining chips in global negotiations. Capturing Guadeloupe or Martinique might not lead to permanent possession, but such conquests could be traded for enormous advantages elsewhere. This insight would shape the logic of the 7 Years' War, in which Britain used its Caribbean victories to strengthen its position in Europe, North America, and beyond. The Caribbean was increasingly seen as a theatre where wealth could be seized quickly and turned into diplomatic leverage. By the time the 7 Years' War erupted, Britain had crafted a new paradigm for tropical warfare. The empire now approached the Caribbean with a combination of speed, joint operations, logistical forethought, and strategic calculation. The lessons of Cartagena were not forgotten. They became the foundation of a new operational doctrine. This recalibration, however, would only be truly tested during the campaigns of 1759-1762, when Britain launched a series of ambitious assaults on French and Spanish possessions. It was during these operations, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Havana, that the full ramifications of Britain's strategic evolution would become clear. The failures of the 1740s had taught Britain how not to fight in the tropics. Now the Redcoat would demonstrate what could be achieved when environmental knowledge, naval power, and determined leadership were aligned. The next section turns to the campaign that embodied this transformation most clearly: the conquest of Guadeloupe in 1759, the moment when Britain translated its hard-won lessons into decisive victory. When British forces sailed for the Caribbean in 1759, they carried with them the ghosts of Cartagena. The failures of the 1740s still weighed heavily on strategic thinking. But unlike the earlier era of hubris, the 7 Years' War brought a new British approach, one shaped by hard-earned lessons in disease management, amphibious integration, and realistic assessments of enemy strongholds. The campaign for Guadeloupe revealed what Britain could achieve when those insights were properly applied. It marked a dramatic shift in Britain's tropical warfare and became one of the most important, yet least remembered, milestones in the rise of British imperial power. Guadeloupe was not the primary target. The original intention was to capture Martinique, France's key stronghold in the Caribbean. Martinique's Fort Royal commanded one of the best harbours in the region and served as a base for privateers who preyed on British shipping. But British reconnaissance quickly revealed the island's formidable geography. Steep, forested hills and difficult approaches gave the defenders natural advantages. The French garrison, supported by local militia, could easily withdraw into the interior and force a prolonged campaign, precisely the kind of operation that Cartagena had proven so deadly. British commanders, remembering the consequences of underestimating environmental realities, made a strategic pivot. Rather than grind themselves down on Martinique's slopes, they shifted their attention to Guadeloupe, whose geography and defensive layout offered more favourable conditions for a rapid conquest. This decision illustrated Britain's new realism. Martinique was valuable, but not valuable enough to justify a tropical quagmire. Guadeloupe, by contrast, provided both a major economic prize and a target vulnerable to joint naval-land operations. British commanders recognised that Sugar Islands needed to be evaluated not only by wealth, but by how decisively they could be taken. In this calculus, Guadeloupe became the ideal proving ground for Britain's reformed Caribbean strategy. Operations began in January 1759, with a naval bombardment of Basse-Terre, the island's principal town and administrative centre. This bombardment was not a symbolic gesture. It was an application of a core lesson from earlier failures: soften coastal defences thoroughly before attempting land assaults. British ships unleashed sustained fire that reduced key positions and disrupted French coordination. When the Redcoats landed, they did so under the protective umbrella of naval guns, which minimised the risk from French artillery. The landing was executed deliberately and systematically, emphasising control rather than speed, a striking contrast to some of the more rushed operations of the previous war. Once ashore, the British faced the second phase of the Caribbean challenge, the interior. Guadeloupe's inland terrain consisted of rugged hills, ravines, dense vegetation, and narrow coastal plains. These features posed serious challenges for any conventional army. But unlike at Cartagena, British commanders avoided the mistake of pushing large numbers of troops deep into disease-prone interior zones without preparation. Instead, they combined coastal consolidation with limited inland advances. Small unit tactics replaced the rigid line maneuvers of European warfare. Coordination between detachments improved, and British commanders sought to maintain pressure without overexposure. Even so, disease quickly made itself felt. Tropical fever swept through the British ranks, hospitalising roughly a quarter of the entire force within weeks. At one point, nearly half of the soldiers were unfit for duty. The mortality rate, though high, did not completely cripple the army as it had at Cartagena or later at Havana. This was due in part to greater reliance on naval vessels as floating hospitals and to improved camp management, a sign that the British were learning how to contain, if not defeat, the environmental forces at play. Leadership during the campaign was a study in adaptation. General Peregrine Hobson, overall army commander, fell gravely ill early in the operation and died shortly afterward. His successor, Major General John Barrington, inherited an army struggling with disease and facing protracted resistance from French defenders. Yet Barrington demonstrated the steady, pragmatic style that the tropics demanded. He refused to advance recklessly into terrain that would exhaust his men, and instead pursued a war of controlled pressure, clearing coastal strongholds, cutting French supply lines, and compelling local militia to retreat steadily inland. As British forces advanced along the coast and seized key positions, the French defence gradually disintegrated. French regulars were few in number, and the island's militia could not match the British in prolonged confrontations, especially once naval firepower isolated French positions. The local population, composed largely of enslaved workers and free people of colour, held no particular loyalty to the French crown and had little incentive to support a prolonged defence. This social dynamic, often overlooked in traditional narratives, played a quiet but significant role. British occupation, though not liberating in any moral sense, presented fewer immediate hardships than military devastation. The French defenders could not rely on a population willing to endure the suffering of a long siege. By May 1759, after months of steady attrition, isolation, and erosion of defensive will, Guadeloupe surrendered. A French relief fleet, dispatched too late and facing British naval superiority, could not intervene. The island fell into British hands. Although the victory was not permanent, Britain would later return Guadeloupe in diplomatic negotiations. It proved transformative. Guadeloupe demonstrated that Britain could achieve decisive results in the Caribbean when it applied the lessons of earlier disasters. It showed that the combination of naval dominance, controlled pacing, flexible tactics, and realistic strategic choices could overcome even the region's daunting environmental obstacles. It also proved that France's Caribbean strongholds were not invincible. Britain's success in 1759 formed part of the broader Annus Mirabilis, a year of victories across multiple continents that signalled the emergence of Britain as the preeminent global power. Yet the success at Guadeloupe, impressive as it was, did not mark the end of Britain's Caribbean ambitions. Emboldened by victory and increasingly confident in its tropical strategy, Britain soon set its sights on far more formidable prizes. Martinique remained unconquered. Havana, the most vital Spanish naval base in the Americas, beckoned. In these coming campaigns, Britain would push its adaptations to their limits and discover that the tropics, though partially understood, remained capable of inflicting terrible losses. Victory in the Caribbean was never cheap, and the empire would soon be reminded of this brutal truth. With Guadeloupe secured and the British war machine accelerating across the globe, the Caribbean became the next arena in which Britain intended to break French and Spanish power outright. Two targets stood out: Martinique, the jewel of the French Caribbean, and Havana, the keystone of Spain's Atlantic Empire. Each represented a strategic, economic, and psychological prize of the highest order. Yet each also carried risks far greater than Guadeloupe. These were not marginal colonies, but heavily fortified bastions, defended by difficult terrain, experienced garrisons, and the ever-present silent army of tropical disease. The British campaigns that followed demonstrated both the peak of Britain's amphibious capability and the limits of human endurance in the Caribbean theatre. Martinique, long recognised as the most formidable of the French sugar islands, was first up. Its mountainous interior and rugged volcanic ridges were natural fortifications that dwarfed those of Guadeloupe. Coastal batteries bristled at key landing points. Fort Royal, one of the most robust coastal fortresses in the Caribbean, guarded the principal harbour and served as the operational centre for French privateering. British planners understood that the capture of Martinique would disrupt French trade, cripple France's ability to support other Caribbean colonies, and strengthen Britain's hand in the global contest of the 7 Years' War. But Martinique also represented a dilemma. The island's terrain favoured defenders who could retreat inland, forcing the attackers into lengthy and exhausting operations. Britain had avoided this trap in the earlier phase of the war by shifting attention to Guadeloupe. Now, however, the political and strategic stakes had risen. Success in 1759 had emboldened the British command. Admirals and generals believed that the combination of naval supremacy, reorganised logistics, and refined amphibious tactics would allow them to succeed where they had previously hesitated. In early 1762, Britain launched a renewed offensive against Martinique. The campaign revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Britain's tropical doctrine. Naval gunfire quickly neutralised French coastal batteries and enabled landings across multiple points. British troops moved inland with determination and flexibility, avoiding earlier mistakes of rigid formation warfare. The defenders were gradually pushed back toward Fort Royal. Yet the same environmental pressures that had tested the army at Guadeloupe now returned with greater intensity. Disease once again swept through British ranks. Supply routes became choked by rain, mud, and broken terrain. French militia units, though outmatched in open combat, used the island's geography to delay and wear down British detachments. Nevertheless, British persistence carried the day. Fort Royal, bombarded from land and sea, became untenable. French morale collapsed under the dual pressure of naval blockade and systematic British advances. When Martinique surrendered, it marked a monumental blow to French imperial prestige. Britain now controlled the largest and richest of France's Caribbean possessions. The conquest did not occur quickly or cheaply, but it represented a triumph of coordination and operational discipline unseen in the earlier decades of Britain's Caribbean warfare. Yet even Martinique paled in comparison to the next objective: Havana. As Spain entered the war on the side of France in 1762, British planners saw an opportunity and a necessity to seize the greatest naval base in the Caribbean. Havana was not simply another sugar island. It was the linchpin of Spanish transatlantic logistics, a heavily fortified harbour that protected treasure fleets and served as the repair centre for Spanish naval forces throughout the region. Its fall would cripple Spain's ability to conduct maritime operations and potentially open the door to British dominance from Jamaica to Florida. But Havana was also one of the most heavily defended ports in the world. Fortifications ringed the harbour, the most imposing of which was Morro Castle, perched atop a cliff that commanded the entrance. The garrison was experienced, and the local militia was substantial. The city itself held abundant resources and fresh water, unless, of course, those supplies fell into British hands. The British assault on Havana began with a massive amphibious landing east of the city, supported by a fleet of staggering size. The initial landings proceeded with impressive precision. Siege lines were established, artillery emplaced, and British engineers began the laborious task of reducing Morro Castle. But almost immediately, disease struck. Yellow fever swept through the camps with horrifying speed. Within weeks, thousands of British soldiers were incapacitated. Even as the siege advanced successfully, the army was dying in shocking numbers behind its own lines. Some regiments lost more men to fever in a single month than they had in entire campaigns in Europe. Despite this grim toll, the British pressed forward. Morro Castle was subjected to relentless bombardment and eventually breached. A storming party captured the fortress after fierce fighting, clearing the way for British forces to turn their guns on Havana itself. By August 1762, after sustained bombardment, the Spanish commander capitulated. Havana fell, along with a huge cache of Spanish ships, artillery, and treasure. It was one of Britain's most spectacular victories of the century, but it was also among the costliest. More than 5,000 British soldiers died, the vast majority from disease. Thousands more sailors succumbed aboard the fleet. The mortality rate was so severe that British authorities struggled to find healthy troops to garrison the newly captured city. Havana, in victory, had become a graveyard. Strategically, the The conquest of Havana represented the culmination of Britain's tropical warfare evolution. It proved that overwhelming force, tight naval-land integration, and determined operational execution could overcome even the strongest Caribbean defences. Politically, it propelled Britain to the apex of global power by 1763. Yet it also demonstrated the enduring constraints of Caribbean warfare. No matter how refined British strategy became, no matter how powerful the navy or disciplined the army, the environment retained a veto power over human ambition. Triumph was possible, but only at staggering cost. And this brings us to the deeper question at the heart of Britain's Caribbean saga. What was the true legacy of these victories? And why have they faded so completely from the public memory of empire? The final section turns to these issues, examining how the Caribbean Sugar Wars reshaped the British Empire, and why they are now among its most forgotten chapters. By the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Britain had achieved what earlier generations might have considered impossible. It had captured or threatened the richest sugar islands of France, seized the greatest naval base of Spain in the Caribbean, and demonstrated a global military reach unmatched by any European power. The triumphs at Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Havana, combined with victories in North America, West Africa, and India, created a geopolitical reality in which Britain emerged not merely as a successful maritime state, but as the dominant imperial power of the 18th century. Yet these achievements came at a price so immense, and in a context so morally fraught, that they would later be pushed to the edge of national memory. The Caribbean Sugar Wars, once central to British prosperity, would fade into the background of imperial history, overshadowed, uncomfortable, and largely forgotten. The most immediate legacy of these campaigns was geopolitical. By crippling French and Spanish power in the Caribbean, Britain gained extraordinary leverage at the peace table. Although it did not retain all the hard-won islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Havana were traded back in exchange for other concessions. The message was unmistakable. Britain could strike decisively at the economic heart of its rivals. That diplomatic leverage reshaped the map. France ceded Canada. Spain ceded Florida. Britain's imperial frontiers expanded across continents, enabling the empire to project influence from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. The Caribbean campaigns were thus not isolated exploits, but foundational to the creation of a truly global British Empire. Economically, the impact was just as profound. Even temporary conquests disrupted French and Spanish sugar production, boosting British plantation profits and strengthening London's control over Atlantic trade. The sugar economy continued to generate massive wealth, reinforcing Britain's financial capacity to sustain prolonged global warfare. Yet the economic dimension cannot be separated from its human cost. The wealth generated by Caribbean sugar was inseparable from the exploitation of enslaved Africans whose labour sustained the system. The same plantations that enriched British merchants and politicians represented one of the most brutal labour regimes in history. British victories in the Caribbean did not end this system, they enabled it. The empire fought to defend and expand a trade rooted in slavery, a reality that complicates any attempt to frame these campaigns as unambiguously heroic. The human cost extended far beyond the enslaved. The British military losses were staggering. At Havana, more than 4,000 soldiers died from disease in just a few months. When combined with naval casualties, the total number of deaths far exceeded those caused by enemy action in many major European wars. The same pattern appeared at Guadeloupe, Martinique, and earlier at Cartagena. The Caribbean, more than any European battlefield, served as a grim reminder that victory could be Pyrrhic. The empire could win territory, secure naval bases, and protect its trade, but it often did so at the expense of thousands of lives destroyed not by enemy fire, but by an environment indifferent to their presence. These sacrifices, however, did not translate into lasting public memory. The Caribbean campaigns lacked the narrative clarity of European battles. They produced fewer stirring stories of gallantry and more accounts of fever, attrition, and logistical misery. Victories were often followed by diplomatic reversals, with Britain returning conquered islands in treaty negotiations. For many, the idea that soldiers died by the hundreds to capture territories ultimately exchanged for distant lands seemed confusing or wasteful. As later generations glorified the defence of the British Isles, the triumphs of Waterloo, or the expansion into India, the Caribbean stage, where Britain fought most ruthlessly for economic advantage, grew increasingly invisible. Moral discomfort also played a role in this amnesia. As attitudes towards slavery shifted in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Britain sought to recast its imperial identity as a force for abolition and moral progress. Celebrating wars that enabled the expansion of plantation slavery became unacceptable. Even the military achievements themselves, amphibious landings, siegecraft, naval bombardments, were overshadowed by the knowledge that the system they protected was built on human exploitation. British historians of the Victorian era, consumed by narratives of progress and civilization, preferred to emphasize campaigns that aligned with these self-images. The Caribbean sugar wars, with their harsh realities and ethically fraught purpose, were quietly set aside. Yet if these wars faded from popular consciousness, their consequences did not. The diplomatic gains from 1763 laid the foundations for British hegemony in North America and India. The profits of the Caribbean economy helped finance industrial growth. The operational lessons learned, rapid amphibious assaults, naval land integration, and health management, shaped British military doctrine for decades. Even the recognition of disease as a strategic factor influenced later imperial medicine and the development of tropical health practices. The Caribbean was a proving ground not just for soldiers, but for ideas that would govern British imperial conduct worldwide. The legacy, therefore, is complex. The Caribbean Sugar Wars were victories achieved through a combination of strategic adaptation, naval supremacy, and sheer persistence in the face of environmental adversity. They reshaped the empire, enriched the nation, and demonstrated Britain's capacity to wage global war. But they also exposed the moral contradictions and human costs of that empire. These campaigns remind us that imperial power rests not only on celebrated battles, but also on forgotten struggles, fought in distant lands for purposes that later generations might find troubling. To revisit the Caribbean Sugar Wars is to confront the full reality of empire, its ambition, its ruthlessness, its ingenuity, and its capacity for both triumph and tragedy. It is to recognize that the global dominance Britain achieved in the 18th century was forged not merely in the fields of Europe, but in the fever-ridden hills of Guadeloupe, the fortresses of Martinique, and the deadly siege lines of Havana. The Redcoat in the Tropics did not fight for glory, but his suffering and sacrifice profoundly shaped the world that followed. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.